My guest today is Dr. Christof Koch, who's a meritorious investigator and ex-CEO and principal scientist at the Allen Institute for Brain Sciences. I hope I got that right, Christoph.
The
His writings
president.
and interests integrate theoretical, computational, and experimental neuroscience with philosophy and contemporary trends, in particular artificial intelligence. His latest book is Then I Am Myself the World, What Consciousness Is and How to Expand It. Welcome, Christoph.
Thank you for having me on, Gil.
Yeah, so I don't know if you remember, we talked at the height of COVID, maybe
Yes,
4 years ago.
4 years ago, yes.
Yes, and time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it? So you have this book out. The book is out for at least a year now, right?
It's about a year, yeah.
Yeah. And it's a very interesting title. So you send me a couple of chapters. So in the introduction, you say here, as any story should, this book starts at the beginning with the dawn of consciousness, our first subjective experience. Did they occur in the womb, during birth, or as an infant? How would we know? Answering these questions has surprising consequences, especially for the bitterly fought war around abortion. Yeah, so consciousness is a concept I have thought about. I know nothing about it. And a lot of people have been thinking about it. It doesn't have a very clean definition, but everybody has it. Um, everybody knows they're conscious. But this longitudinal question you're asking, when does it start and when does it end? We know when it ends. I mean, ultimately ends, but we don't quite know when it starts, right?
Well, even when it ultimately ends, that's not always easy because life may. So one question is life coextensive with consciousness? In other words, are you, as soon as you're alive? So let's take a first term fetus. The fetus, no question, is alive. It depends on the mother's wound and supply all the nutrients by the umbilical cord, etc. But it's alive. Is it therefore also conscious? Same thing with at the end of life. You may well be alive. You may well be let's say, in a coma. Terry Schiavo comes to mind, where she was clearly alive, yet uh, she does not appear to be conscious. So that's one question. Uh, and then if we assume, yes, you can dissociate life, so in other words, you can be alive without being conscious, then there's a question, well, when you first start to be conscious, is it, most people think it's somewhere in the third trimester when the fetus first when the circuits are in place, particularly the cortical thalamus circuits are in place to support consciousness. Certainly, newborn seems to display sort of the complex behavior we associate with consciousness. And then at the end of life, probably with particular if you're under heavy sedation, consciousness may disappear, may be gone, partly pharmacologically before your brain actually dies. And of course, death itself is not a discrete one-point process in time, but there are different things going on over minutes or hours as you undergo the final stage that we're all going to undergo sooner or later. And
Yeah,
then you can
so
ask the same question, by the way, Gil, about other creatures. I mean, if it's
yeah.
true that life is coextensive with consciousness, at least so as long as you're alive, you're conscious, then what about other creatures? Not just dogs and cats, that most people assume share consciousness with us, but what about, simpler creatures, birds, bees, worms, flies, a single-celled paramecium? They're clearly alive. Does it therefore also feel like something to be a paramecium? Probably very little, but does it feel like something to be conscious? And more in biology, or students of consciousness assume, yeah, it's probably true that that most life may well be conscious.
Yeah. So the sort of the technical question here is, is it programmatic?
What do you mean by
I
that?
really, yeah, I really dislike this idea of emergence, and you have talked about this quite a bit. I don't know what people mean by something emerging. I think it's a cop out at many different levels. Um, and so I was thinking, I'm not an expert on this, obviously, Christoph. So I'm thinking, suppose we start at consciousness. We know it exists. Um, our attempts have been largely focused on reductionism, going down from consciousness into physicality or whatever they call it nowadays. Um, but then there is an equally interesting axis upwards from consciousness. I mean, consciousness could be a property that we can observe, but then we haven't really looked upward from there. There could be a whole new universe out there away from reductionism, right?
Yeah, so you're right. So I've also always been skeptical about emergence. So first of all, before we talk about its fault, what is emergence? Well, emergence is a belief that at some level a property doesn't exist. Let's see, at a small enough reductionist level, the classical example is wetness of water. You take two molecules of H2O, and no one talks about the wetness of two molecules or 10 or 1,000 molecules. But
Yeah,
then if you put enough of them together, somewhere you get this property called wetness, sticking to walls, etc. We all know what wet is and how it's different from solid and gas. And we know in principle how it emerges out of the molecular property of individual ions and atoms. So there's nothing in that sense mysterious about it. That once you
yeah,
understand the physics, it makes sense that certain properties only manifest at large scale.
yeah,
And so that's one explanation is, yeah, you don't get consciousness if you have, one neuron or 10 neurons, but once you get to 42 neurons or whatever your magic number is,
yes,
then you become conscious. But the challenge with that is, as you know, consciousness is so radical different from anything else. It's not clear why 42, to pick a random number, atoms should feel like something, but 41 don't. I mean, how do the feelings come into it? And so it's been a
yeah,
promissory note of
yeah,
long standing that at some point we'll understand how it emerges, but no one has ever explained how in actually practice this is supposed to happen. So yes, like you, I'm extremely skeptical, and I'm of the opinion we need to start with consciousness because, as you said, the only thing we're sure of is my consciousness. I know that I see, I feel, I know I'm Christ, I have the self-consciousness, etc. And so that has to be the starting point. And even as a scientist, I'm still restricted to seeing things on an oscilloscope or hearing people talk about theory of relativity or reading about it. So ultimately, the only way I access, any of us accesses the world is by our conscious experience. And so it seems more natural to say, well, fundamentally what exists is just experiences.
yeah.
But
So I wondered if it's a human measurement problem, the sense that if consciousness is a continuous function, as you say, from a single cell organism to complex animals, if it's a continuous function, at some point humans say, "Hey, I can see it, I can measure it," but that doesn't mean that it starts there. So it could be everywhere potentially.
potentially, the problem is not, I mean, we cannot measure it. I would put it slightly different. I would say, why is consciousness more difficult to study than, let's say, charge or mass or black holes or brains, etc.? Because ultimately, I only know about my own consciousness. I
Yeah,
don't know about yours.
right.
And you can know a person, you can be married to a person for 40 years. You make love, your bodies are penetrating each other, but you look into his or her eyes, but finally, you don't know what he or she is experiencing.
Mm,
Right? And of course, we can all be, or we can imagine, and movies and books and operas are full of this, where someone, says, I love you, but they have an affair with someone else, because ultimately we don't know. So that's a fundamental challenge. Is sort of our version of the measurement problem,
Yeah.
that I cannot directly measure consciousness. I can infer it because you can speak. In fact, I'm developing a tool to be used in the clinic to test
Mm.
consciousness, to detect consciousness in behavioral unresponsive vegetative state patient. But it's always an inference. In
Yeah.
babies, I have to infer that they're most likely conscious. My dog, I infer that probably he's conscious. But in the final
Mm.
analysis, I cannot directly measure consciousness. It's a way. This is an existential fact. We only know about our own consciousness.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So is consciousness sort of an entity that is um, that's in you? Let's say I'm just making a statement. You can obviously react to it, and then you go, like you say, I say I love you, and then you go have an affair, um, and then you have to go back to your consciousness, and the consciousness is going to disapprove of that behavior. So, in other words, what I'm asking is consciousness is a sort of a separate entity from you?
No, I mean, so I think you're referring, when you refer, for example, to going back and then you feel guilty, that's really self-consciousness. So
Okay.
self-consciousness is something that we adults have, particularly literary adults, highly educated adults who think about themselves and read books about them and watch movies, read Virginia Woolf and all of that. Um,
Yeah.
my dog clearly can also feel guilty. I mean, I know when my dog has committed something, and the dog, behaves differently. But if you
Yeah.
think about even simpler creatures, a snail or a bee, does a bee have guilt? I don't know. Presumably not, because I don't think it has a self-consciousness. A baby doesn't really know guilt, because I think
Mm.
a baby is clearly conscious but doesn't really have a sense of self yet. The sense of self emerges, starts, you can start to see it in children once they start talking, age 3 or 4. And then over the next 15 years, it develops. This is why, of course, we
Mhm.
say children below the age of 18 aren't fully responsible for themselves, because they haven't yet developed the brain cells to think
Mm.
about themselves and reason and have any measure of self-control or self-discipline. This is something that takes, typically, in the third decade of your life, between, 20 and 30, it really, and then, of course, it can keep on increasing. So,
Yeah.
so that's one aspect of consciousness, the consciousness of self, which you can lose, of course, in certain types of your life, where your ego dissolves in various cases. So, but we shouldn't confuse self-consciousness with all of consciousness. If you just have chronic pain in your tooth,
Mhm.
okay, and it's god awful bad, and you want to kill yourself, and some people do kill themselves in their chronic pain, there's
Mhm.
nothing particular intelligent about it. There's nothing particular self about it. It's just this god awful pain pounding away at you.
Yeah.
And so there you don't have much of a sense of self.
Yeah. So you said, you mentioned when a baby or a kid starts to talk, that's a major discontinuity. So I want to go on a little bit of a tangent, Christoph. So we have this LLMs, large language models, that everybody is running after, calling it artificial intelligence. Uh, do you think language is integral to intelligence and consciousness?
Well, okay, so I think, as you're sort of alluding to, they're really different things. Intelligence ultimately is about acting at various time scales. Short term, you ask ChatGPT a question, it gives you an answer. Or long term planning, when you ask it, I recently did. How do I prepare for Medicare? What do I need to do? And it gives me all these lengthy answer, right? So that's long term planning for what happens if I retire in a couple of years from now. But that's all of that. So it's about doing ultimately. All of that is different from consciousness, which is really about being in love, being angry, being in pain.
Mm.
So we shouldn't confuse one with the other. And children, pre-linguistic competent children, let's say at age 2, they're already conscious, but they can't, because the brain is still maturing and developing, they haven't yet developed the speech apparatus and the vocabulary, and that happens gradually, between the age of, 2.5 and 5, 6, 7. Um, so intelligence and speaking is different from consciousness. Although in most of us, at least in adult humans, to infer your state of consciousness, I asked you, Gil, how do you feel today? Do you feel sad? Do you feel happy? Are you excited? Are you depressed about the state of the world? So there I'm trying to get at your current conscious experience via behavior, in this case, via language.
Mm.
So it's a
So,
vehicle necessary to talk about consciousness, but it's independent of consciousness. Yeah, in people who are perfectly mute, people who never spoke in their
yeah,
life, they're still highly conscious.
yeah, I quite like that. So I quite like, so if you have a bucket of intelligence and a bucket of consciousness, language may go into the bucket of intelligence, but that is distinctly different from the consciousness bucket. And we don't know what is in it, actually. I mean, we've been seeking answers, but we haven't come up with
No, we
anything
don't know.
specific.
We don't know
Yeah.
what's in that bucket. It's your life. It's your
Yeah.
experience. It's your pain. It's your pleasure. It's your feeling of being happy or angry or in love. That's
Yeah.
what in it. Look,
It's
if I tell you, Gil, I give you $1 billion,
yeah.
but there's, it's a devil's bargain. I'm going to remove any and all experience.
Yeah.
So no more seeing, no more loving, no more feeling, no more dreaming, no more imagining, but you can still talk,
Yeah.
so I'll turn you into a total zombie.
Yeah.
So no one else from the outside, you still look like you're conscious, but it doesn't feel like anything anymore. Would you take this
But
bargain?
there is a horizon problem there. So I would take that bargain if I am very close to exit, let's say, because
But you
I
won't
am
be there.
already on a path to losing all of that. Yeah,
Yeah, but you won't be there.
I know.
So
I
this
know.
is a problem when people want to upload themselves or
Yeah,
create avatars for themselves. I understand for others. So let's say for my children, once there is this digital avatar, yeah, they can maybe query this avatar of their dad and see what dad would have said. But
it's
for
very
me as an
creepy.
avatar, it doesn't feel like anything. I'm still dead. My conscious experience is not going to be in that avatar.
Right, right. Yeah, so I know what you mean. I mean, but it's a qualitative description. What we feel, what we experience is integral to consciousness. Um, that would that would imply at least the artificial intelligence path that we are on. We're never going to get to this what they call this general intelligence. For me, general intelligence is closer to consciousness. It's not the same, obviously, but so I think you're on a wrong path on this AI thing, because it is in a very much in the reductionist channel, right? So if I can write down a program, or if I can feed a machine all the history, everything on the internet, and the machine can stochastically parrot with some probability answers to your question, and it seems to work pretty well, but it has nothing to do with the machine being conscious. And I would argue that the machines that we create in silicon can never be conscious. What do you think?
Yeah. So yes. So let's say right now you can ask. So I use GPT 5.0, pretty much every day. It's very smart, knows a lot. It hallucinates, but so do people. So you have to check answers if it's really important enough. And of course, because it's been fed every single novel in the English language and presumably in other languages too, of course it knows about love and hate and interiority, because that's what novels are about. They're all about interiority. So I'm not particularly surprised. It would be much more interesting if you could do like Alpha Zero, so DeepMind trained, they had a series of game playing software, first chess, then Go, of course, famously. And
Yeah.
the initial Go was trained on 100,000 existing Go games. But then they did Alpha Go Zero, right, where
Mhm.
they only gave it the rules, which of course are trivial. And
Yeah.
then it just through relentlessly reinforcement learning, it learned itself to become, the grandmaster of Go. Now, if we could do something similar with interiority, if we could avoid feeding it anything having to do, so in other words, no novels. I mean, most of text it would have to be eliminated unless it's strictly third person, like tech manual. So if you just feed LLM, just manuals,
Yeah.
anything you want, where it just talks objectively about doing this and that, the other. Will it ever by itself discover seeing or hearing or touching or feeling, or will it just talk about behavior? And I think it would only talk about behavior. Um, uh, yes. Now you can ask, so this is my intuition. But
Yeah.
ultimately, of course, we don't want to, and your intuition, but we don't just want to depend on intuition. We need a scientific and a well-accepted scientific theory of consciousness that tells us which bits and pieces of matter have the thing we call consciousness. These things do, but we both agree that right now these things probably don't. Well, but let's say I want to have a theory that tells me precisely why does my iPhone not feel like something?
Mm.
We don't have such we don't have a generally accepted theory, but we have some candidates. And one of the best known candidates is integrated information theory.
Yeah.
Uh,
Talk a
I,
little bit about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so IIT, Integrated Information Theory, so device, the chief architect is an Italian-American psychiatrist and neuroscientist, Giulio Tononi. And it has this very precise approach where it starts, so it's one of the few theories of consciousness that doesn't start with the brain. It starts actually with consciousness. So it starts from consciousness to derive uh, what is the physical what are the operational defined properties of a system, like a physical system, like a brain or a machine, a digital computer or any other machine, a quantum system. What properties does the system have to obey in order to have experiences?
Mm.
And it's what's a strength and maybe also a weakness of the theory is it makes very precise what it means by
Mm.
consciousness and how to detect it and how to compute it explicitly. In fact, you can go to integratedinformationtheory.org and download Python code, computer code, that tells you for any particular system where you can write down a complete description using what's called a transition probability matrix, or a
Yeah.
description of all possible states of the system and how do you go from one state to the other state. How is this system conscious? Uh, Defined as does it have integrated information, some amount of
Mm.
integrated information. The letter phi is often used to denote that, the Greek
Yeah.
letter phi, and essentially says as long as the system has non-zero amount of integrated information,
Mm.
it will be conscious. The
Mm.
larger this number phi, the integrated into information about the system, the more it will be conscious. One way to think about it is irreducible. The more the system is irreducible to its component, the more it is conscious. So if a system has no integrated information, if phi is zero, that means it strictly speaking doesn't exist as a system. It can be described as two or more independent systems that don't really interact with each other.
Mm.
So in principle, you can apply this calculus to any system, brain, I mean, either evolved like brains or non-evolved, engineered like computer. And before I come to that, its other intuition is based on this axiomatic approach where it starts off with conscious experience. because every conscious experience is highly differentiated. What that means
Sure.
is, if you just think about every frame of every movie you've ever seen, it's just trillions of possible movie frames, right? And each one is different. Each one is different from everyone else. And then you cross that with auditory experience, with body experiences, with sexual experience. I mean, it's just a gigantic, uncountable universe of possible experiences. But every experience is also one. I don't have two distinct conscious experiences at any given point in time. It's only one. And so it requires that, I mean, those demands require, if you look at the substrate of consciousness, that the substrate be highly integrated, but also differentiated. What that means, you want very rich interconnections, but it can't just be that everything is connected to everything, to every other possible element. So in principle, you can apply this to digital computers, and it has. There's a paper on bioRxiv. And what you can show that even advanced, let's say, inference engine for LLMs, because of the architecture, where typically you have, transformers, to step back, are purely feed-forward systems, right? The transformer, the algorithm that underlies LLMs. And deep networks are primarily feed-forward systems. All of those systems are, by the definition of IIT, not integrated. They would not feel like anything. And even if you add a few feedback connection, it's very impoverished. So either the integrated information of the system is zero or it's tiny. Compared to, if I look at the substrate, the neuronal substrate of consciousness, cortex, it's highly, highly integrated. Each neuron talks to, depending where you are and what species, between 10,000 and 100,000 other neurons. So it gets input from 10 to 100,000 other neurons and projects to 10 or somewhere between 10 and 100,000 other neurons with vast amount of overlap. There's nothing like it in silicon. And today, so based on this, and you can show this formally, you can show that two systems can do the same thing. So functionally, computationally, they're totally equivalent. In other words, the same input will give rise to the same output. But then if you look at under the hood, one system is primarily feed forward, and the other system is heavily interconnected, but they both do the same thing. IIT says, even though they are functionally equivalent, this one is not conscious, the one that's feed forward, while the system that's highly interconnected is highly conscious, or maybe highly conscious.
So the
constitution, just to finish, so what really matters for consciousness is not input-output behavior, but it's a constitution of the system. It has to be highly complex, differentiated, and integrated.
Yeah, so let me give you a very trivial example. So I have like a dozen routers at home. I'm sort of a home automation nut. And I've been trying to figure this out. So typically when you connect a device to a router, it goes to the nearest one. This is a wired connection by Ethernet. My few computers don't do that. It goes to the end of the line. It goes to the last router. They're all daisy chained in the system. There is no logic to it. I mean, I've been seeking what the logic might be, but I can't find any. So this is sort of a obviously there is nothing there in terms of intelligence or anything, but there is a level of randomness that might give you. So let me ask you this differently: is randomness a necessary property of intelligence?
Intelligence or consciousness?
Consciousness, let's say, yeah.
It may be that elements do have to have a certain indeterminacy It's difficult to say right now. I mean, there are, of course, quantum mechanical theories of consciousness, right? Roger
Yeah.
Penrose most famously,
Yeah.
and variants of thereof that essentially say, the so-called the collapse of the wave function, the observer problem in quantum mechanics may give rise to consciousness. Right now, there's no direct evidence for that. We can't rule it out. There's no direct evidence for that. So we don't know. It's a good question. We don't know. Now, in your case, is it truly random, or is it just that it has to do with the exact delay, and the delay varies with the phase? You have
Yeah.
DC, AC. Maybe it's a function of the phase of the voltage supply or things like that, or is it
Yeah. Yeah.
truly random in the quantum mechanical
But only
sense?
the
I don't know.
computers, only the computers do that. So I was trying to find the engineering reason for this. All of the devices connect to the closest possible point. Just the computers go to the end of the daisy chained system, and it's sort of an interesting phenomenon. So I want to go into your chapter 7 and chapter 8,
I mean, of
which
course,
is
there's also
yeah.
lots of randomness in your brain, right?
Yes,
That's why
yes,
you rarely do the same thing under similar circumstances, right?
yeah,
Because your brain constantly evolves. And even under constant condition, I mean, I used to do this experiment for my PhD where I had to count flies and chase flies into a labyrinth. And you get, we're talking about now flies, much simpler model systems than you or I. The fly comes to a point in the road, and sometimes it takes a left, sometimes it takes a right, sometimes the same fly will turn back, and sometimes the fly will just sit and stay put there. And even genetically identical flies, because even a fly is already a very complicated systems, and
yeah.
there's all this classical physics indeterminacy and then of course there's also possibly quantum mechanical determinacy. So I think in the real life, most things have some random element to them.
Mm. So the fly case, in some sense, proves free will, doesn't it? I mean,
Well, that's what
if
some
it is
people say.
complete, yeah, yeah. Go
Yes,
ahead, yeah,
you could interpret it that way, that the
yeah.
fly freely decides to take the left branch when it comes to the fork in the road, or the right branch, or no branch, or turns back. Yeah. So but that's not really what people mean by free will, right? By free will, people don't mean, oh, I pick randomly, but they mean, no, I am free from physical constraints.
Yeah, so the
So
flight
that's a bigger pun?
So have you done this experiment multiple times and identifying
Many
the
times.
flight? So flight 32 coming to the joint. Does flight 32 takes different paths at different times?
Yeah, but of course, on different times, the fly is not the same. So let's say you put it in the first time, and it takes one path, and then you collect it at the end and you put it back. Well, now, for instance, you have to
Oh
rule
yeah,
out that it doesn't smell its previous time,
yeah,
that
yeah,
it smelled where it left. Or the fly now, it's 10 minutes later in its life and something has changed, right? So
yeah.
it's in the real world, it's impossible. You never, as Heraclitus said 2,500 years ago, you never step into the same river twice, right? So that's an academic question. In real
Mm.
life, things are never exactly the same.
Yeah, so initial conditions differ. So I want to go into the chapter 7, chapter 8 of your book. I find really, really interesting, Christoph. So first you talk about religious, mystical, and aesthetic experiences. So I'll put my bias on the table. I grew up as a Catholic in South India. I never had any religious experience. I never had any mystical experience. I'm not
So you
very,
have or you have not?
never had. Um, and I'm not very aesthetic either. So it is a foreign concept for me, the religious and mystic experience. I have heard a lot of people talk about them. And so you say here the lives of saints and sages from many religions are filled with foundational episodes of encountering the living God or otherwise directly sensing the presence of something all-encompassing, all-powerful, numinous. Yeah, I found the the Pascal bit very interesting. So you see here, consider Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French philosopher, mathematician, and physicist, pioneer of probability calculus, and co-inventor of the mechanical calculator. After Pascal's death, a handwritten parchment was discovered sewed inside his coat, documenting his divine experience. On the night of November 23rd, 1654, the description starts: fire, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and intellectuals, certitude, certitude, feeling joy, peace. Um, yeah, so that is clearly an experience. Um, a scientist with tremendous capabilities felt, right, had at least for a brief period of time.
Yeah, so there are many accounts. If you just look on the internet, thousands
Yeah.
of accounts of people. The best description is really by the father of American psychology, William James, who taught at Harvard at the around 1900s. And he's written this wonderful book, Varieties of Religious Experiences, where he talks about these transformative experiences, what he means by that. And he himself had some under nitrous oxide.
Mm.
So what he means, he said brief experiences, so under an hour by objective, clock time, lab, external lab clock. Their brief experience, they typically happen totally unbidden, totally
Yeah.
unexpected, where people encounter something that fundamentally changes them. There's a distinct before and after, and people will remember these experiences till the end of their days. This also happens, so religious conversion experiences in many traditions, aesthetic experiences. Schopenhauer talks about them. When people experience music in particular, you can have these cathartic experiences. Near-death experiences. So we now know roughly 10% of people who have so-called in-hospital cardiac arrest, when they come through and they survive, rather than having massive, post-traumatic stress syndrome, they have these amazing experiences that totally, fully transforms them. They are now at ease with death. Most of them will still go on because they're in hospital. Sooner or later they will die, like all of us. But it has just fundamentally changed their attitude to their life and to their death. Or
Yeah.
now, of course, under psychedelics, when people can have these experiences. In fact, there's now a technical term in the literature, in the clinical literature, and among psychiatry and people who do psychedelic tests, called ontological shock.
Mm.
So what can happen during the psychedelic experience, just like for some of those other near-death and religious conversion experience,
Yeah.
that typically you lose a sense of self. Almost always people, they lose a sense of the voice in the head, having a body, being Christof, all of that is gone. And they seem to access what they describe, and I've had such an experience, where whatever remains of you, 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 you experience, or whatever remains of you experience some ultimate reality, which typically is mental, is experiential. And so it's an ontological shock because it totally, we all grew up in a profound physicalist material culture. It's all about, it's all about ultimately matter. What really exists is this. And, anything else, it doesn't really exist in the same fundamental way. And of course, sooner or later, we'll all die. And, we grew up in this meaningless universe. But then you have this experience, and you say, "Oh my God, I was so wrong. This is all." Suddenly, you
Yeah.
feel you've accessed what is truly fundamental reality. Now, some people say, "Yeah, you're just, it's just your brain on drugs," you know.
Mm.
Uh, but that doesn't
Yeah.
cut it. This experience has such a powerful, as William James already pointed out 120 years ago in his book, this
Yeah.
experience has such a powerful authority over you
Mm.
that for the rest of your life, people typically have this very ebullient, positive feeling after they come out from one of these experiences. They just, I have seen the truth. I know what it is. You can tell me I was on drug, I was
Mm.
confused or whatever. I have seen what reality really is. It's quite, yeah, it is what people say. It's transformative.
It's transformative. So you say here in psychedelic experiences, many cultures throughout history cured illness, divined the future, or communicated the spirits by drinking, eating, smoking, and inhaling special medicines, what we today consider psychoactive drugs. So I haven't had any experience like this either, Christoph, but um, I know that I know I have two people living in my brain, my left brain and my right brain. And my left brain is typically dominant during daytime. If I take a couple of glasses of red wine, it can be quietened, and then my right brain takes over. So then I can write poetry, not very good, but still could try. Um, going into areas that I don't typically go into. So it is a very useful experiment. So I mean, two questions. One, do you agree with this left right brain hypothesis?
I'm, being a brain scientist, I'm a little, okay, so we know from Roger Sperry's experiments, who got a Nobel Prize for him, that yes, language in most of us is on the left. There's no question. In most of us, we know this. You can have a stroke on the right, and you may not even notice. If you have a stroke in the left, inferior
Mm,
frontal gyrus, you become aphasic. You can't talk anymore.
mm, mm,
It's not clear to what extent things like the self and self-consciousness are lateralized. We
mm.
certainly have evidence you can stimulate both the left and the right, this part of the back of the brain, precuneus, and you get experiences of self. So I don't know whether the left and right, the self really is primarily located in the left. Those aspects that we use to communicate ourselves with to other people, when you talk to your spouse how you really feel, yeah, they may be left. So when you drink several glasses of wine, you do silence, you do quiet yourself, there's no question about it. I don't
Yeah.
know whether the best way to think about it is it the left or the right brain, but it doesn't really matter. It is what you say, it's true.
Mm,
There are all sorts of ways you can quiet yourself. I mean, the one that many of us know is being in the flow. When you're in the flow, composing poetry, playing free jazz, in an ensemble, climbing, running, coding, doing anything that's
mm.
sufficiently demanding, but that
Yeah.
takes you away from the sense of self. You can lose the sense of self. And usually we love those activities, right? We come back to our usual self and with this ebullience, right? This was wonderful. I just lost
Mm.
track of the last 2 hours because I was doing whatever, poetry or writing code.
Yeah, so for me, the scope changes quite dramatically. I think you talk about this too. So the scope changes from 1 to 8 billion. And then the objective functions, optimization, routines, everything changes. And then you can see different things that you haven't been really seeking, right? So um, it's like daytime, you're trying to optimize yourself. When you quiet down, you're optimizing the universe to some extent.
Yeah, I would use slightly different languages, but I agree. There are many ways you can. So we are always driven by the self. We need the self, right? And so, in part of growing up an adult, in fact, I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, we need the self to survive, to do long-term planning, right, to raise children and to raise them to be healthy productive individuals, etc. And without having a self, if you go to psychiatry and you see people that have lost a sense of self, that have
Mm.
depersonalization episodes, they're profoundly dysfunctional, right? And we have
Yeah.
to protect them from themselves. So we need the sense of self. But the sense of self can also be obsessive, right? It's when you think it's all about me, or your inner voice constantly belittles you and says it's what you're doing is inadequate, it doesn't measure up. So then we want techniques that reduce that, and that can
Mm.
be what you said. Meditation, I think, is a wonderful way, and of course, meditators also,
Mm.
talk to losing the sense of self or achieving these states of naked awareness, right? A certain Buddhist tradition where they just have this field of luminosity where their self and all these thoughts are totally gone. And
Mm.
they talk about them also in terms of sort of this wonderful state that they achieve. So I think there are many, many ways to achieve this selflessness. We
Selflessness. Yeah.
so literally, I
Yeah.
think that's what you experience. You become. We always live on
Mhm.
within the gravitational field of planet ego, right? We always live on
Yes.
planet ego, and just like an astronaut, when they go into orbit, they become weightless. So under special
Yeah.
cases, whether it's psychedelic or drinking wine or being meditating or being, being in the flow, we can leave this planet and
Yeah.
we can observe and be highly productive and do
Yeah.
something good, but without having the self constantly being involved.
So talk a little bit about psychedelics. I don't have much experience with it. There is a lot of different psychedelics. They're largely from a chemical structure perspective. They are very similar, right? Many of them.
Yeah, so most of the so the classical ones are magic mushrooms, of course, and then ayahuasca, 5 DMT or 5-MeO DMT, the toad, and then of course synthetic ones, in particular LSD. Chemically, and then there's one ibogaine, which is really quite different
Mm.
biochemically. But the classical serotonergic ones are all very similar. In fact, they mimic a neurotransmitter that you have in your brain and in your
Mm.
gut, in fact, massively, called serotonin. So
Yeah.
these psychedelics are also called serotonergic tryptamine, so serotonergic psychedelics. They're different. Some act like 5-MeO DMT. They can act within 10 seconds, and
Yeah.
and they can shoot you into a state of complete void. I mean, within seconds, and then 10 minutes later, you return from this extraordinary state where everything disappears except, you know, terror or ecstasy or, seeing bright light at the end of the tunnel. Or you can take, mushrooms that are much more gentle, where if you take high enough dose, you can also have selfless episodes of
Mm.
self delusion. But you see, you look at the particular any natural structure that has like fractal, like trees or flowers, you can completely lose yourself in it. Yeah, so they're very different psychedelics. They do different
Mm.
things. Um, some of them you can have these transformative experiences, this ontological shock. And I think that's also the mechanisms of their action, because, of course, as you know, they're being tested right now for treatment resistant depression, for major depressive disorder, for generalized anxiety disorder, for post traumatic stress, etc. And their mode of action is particular when people have these more profound experiences,
Mm.
that this allows you to reevaluate your life because
Yeah.
you've experienced something very different. Then once you come out of it and return to sort of consensual reality, you keep on thinking about this and you keep on thinking. And now, particularly if you have help with friends or therapists, you can evaluate your life and you can say, yeah, this shit happened to me. It's true. I was in battle, or I was sexual molested or whatever, but I can go on. I can accept it for what it was, a terrible experience, and but I can rather than sort of rather than letting it dominate me. And so, to the extent that these psychedelics are therapeutic, I
Mm.
think they also seem to involve the same ontological shock.
Do we get these from plants or do we make them synthetically?
No, I mean all the until in fact the first synthetic was LSD. Right? That was by Hoffman famously in Basel in Switzerland in 1943 during World War II. No, all the classical ones they're all natural found in mushrooms most famously. That's why we call
Mushroom.
them magic mushrooms. Yeah, the
Why
green.
do they? Yeah. Why do you think they produce them?
That's a very good question. So it's a very good question. Um, the standard hypothesis is they're aversive to animals.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can also say, well, they may not be aversive. They may actually be, attractive to animals, certainly like us, because some of these states are, can be very pleasant, just like when you get tipsy with alcohol.
Mm,
So we don't quite know, but most people believe well, obviously we find them in nature. So most of them, in fact, with one exception, the toad, 5-MeO-DMT, they all derive from plants, from one or sometimes combination of two plants. And the
mm.
synthetic one is a modern phenomena within the last 70 years.
Okay. And so the last part here, Christoph, is dying of the light. So you say here, finally, there is a unique class of experiences encountered during life-threatening episodes of near drowning, cardiac arrest, shock, or blunt force trauma. Um, yeah, so I have seen this. People go through this discontinuities or near discontinuities and come out of that with a completely different viewpoint, attitude, and potentially personality, right? And sometimes,
It's the same thing, Gil.
yeah,
It's a transformative experience. I think that again, the trigger is then in the brain. It may be anoxic, that when your brain becomes anoxic,
yeah,
uh, under these in the battlefield or near drowning or at high acceleration in a jet fighter, people they don't have to, and very often they don't, but that seems to enable accessing these states where suddenly you become aware of some other larger reality, and you
mm,
come back and you think, oh, all this reductionist talk. No, we actually live in a universe that's alive and full of meaning. And
mm,
it gives people this tremendous positive boost and outlook on life and what's really important in life and what maybe
mm.
isn't so important, like chasing the almighty dollar. Uh, yeah, so it works against
Yeah.
capitalism.
No, that's not good. We want more capitalists in the country. So so in conclusion, then I'm just thinking that I really quite like the idea of. I haven't really thought about this, Christoph. So I just want to get your perspective. Intelligence is distinctly different from consciousness.
Yes,
Intelligence outputs are something that we can measure from a
yes.
technical sense. Consciousness outputs are not something that we have figured out how to measure. And hence, we really have no ingoing hypothesis when it starts, when it ends, how it progresses, right? That's where we are.
I don't know about the latter. Yeah, so it's important to intelligence is about doing. We
Yeah,
have way to measure it, like IQ tests. Or the Turing test in machines, right? Clearly, GPT 5.0 clearly passes the Turing test, right? You can talk about anything, and it has a reasonable answer. There's no such equivalent of a consciousness test.
yeah,
Um, and we don't know. I don't know how to measure your consciousness and compare it against my consciousness. That doesn't
yeah,
mean that we can't do it with some theory like integrated information theory, but right now we can. We do have ways, I mean, practical ways how we test it.
mm,
So I can tell you, at the end of life in the clinic, because I'm involved in that, the
yeah,
classical way to test is a patient conscious is behavior. You ask them, sir, can you hear me? You shine a light into your eyes. Do you track
yeah,
it?
yeah,
I pinch your fingernail very hard. You withdraw your limb like you have
mm,
actual pain. And if you
mm,
don't do any of that, then you're called behavioral unresponsive, which most people assume means you're unconscious. But we now
Mm,
know that 25%, 1 out of quarter of these patients, although they're unresponsive, are actually present. They're conscious, yet they're
mm,
unable, because of the brain damage they have suffered, they're unable to communicate that they're conscious to the bed at the bedside to the doctor or their loved ones.
mm. I don't quite understand this, Christoph. So the fact that you'll pull out your hand or your feet when you press on them, it's sort of a spinal cord
If it's low
response.
level, yes, yes.
Yeah,
Uh, uh, yeah, so it's always a question, is this just a reflex
yeah,
or is it something higher order? But even if you can't do that anymore, we can
yeah,
certainly agree that even if you don't have those reflexes, you're in bad state. It is true. But being in a bad state doesn't mean you have no experiences. So,
yeah.
so for example, how do we know that some of these people are conscious? Well, if I talk to them, even though they show no signs of understanding, I said, "Sir, can you clench your fist very hard?"
Yeah.
Now, you don't see their fist being clenched. It's still like this. But you ask them, clench your fist very hard and now relax it. And now clench it again very hard. Think about clenching your fist really hard. And then if I put a decoder above your brain, I can
Mm,
see when I ask you to clench your fist very hard, some
yeah,
parts of your brain try to act, and you can see that in the brain activity. So in other words, these people can on command
yeah.
voluntarily modulate their brain activity, although from a behavioral point of view, they look like they're just like
They don't have
this.
the
The motor
mechanistic
cortex, let's say,
connection.
may be
Yeah, yeah,
destroyed. Yeah, they're
yeah.
unable to activate, the signal from the brain, from the motor cortex down the spinal cord to actually, clench their fist. Yet they
Mm,
can still think about it. So they clearly seem to be there.
mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. So I know that we're running out of time. So we'll finish up with this. So a recent Nobel laureate believes that humanity will be completely wiped out by artificial intelligence in about 5 years. Um, I'm not quite convinced of that. I'm on the other extreme. I don't think silicon has any chance of getting to intelligence, let alone consciousness. I think we are spending a lot of money making machines, making the environment warmer. Um, they're all investing into nuclear power plants because we're running out of power. Data centers
Yep.
all around the world. This seems sort of like brain dead. No pun intended. So where do you come down on that?
On some days, I think, why are we the dominant species on the planet? Well, we're the dominant species because we are the most aggressive and the most intelligent. And
Hmm.
here, some of us are building creatures that, are supposed to become more and more intelligent. And of course, if you talk to the militaries, they're all busy building, and you can see it in Ukraine and in Russia, right? You can see how drones are becoming more clever, more adaptive. And
Yeah.
I wonder, is this a good thing? Is this a good thing for Homo sapiens sapiens? I'm skeptical, but here
open,
we are.
open, open question. Yeah.
It's an open question, but here we are. There isn't really too much, any one of us can do about it.
Yeah. So I have an alternative hypothesis to Fermi paradox, and it
Which
goes
is,
something like the Fermi paradox. Why?
yeah,
Why?
yeah.
Where are they? Right?
Where is
The
everyone? Yeah.
extraterrestrials. My hypothesis that if they find us, they're not going to come here. This is like a crazy nutcase
I see.
of
So
intelligence.
we are isolation. We are on the isolation ward, the
Yes,
planetary isolation ward.
that's right. That's my hypothesis. Yeah.
All right.
Excellent. Excellent, Christoph. Yeah, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Okay. Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you about these topics. Always fun.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye.